Over the past year, I've often wanted to discuss Russell Brand. And we did, briefly, during the Kundalini episodes. Brand has always been a play both sides kind of guy, yet as with many conspiritualists, he's hovered dangerously close to conspiracy land. Unlike J.P. Sears, the other comedian in this world, who did go all in, Brand shrugs it off with I'm just a comedian, what do I know? In order to skirt taking responsibility for his often asinine hot takes. Which brings us to a recent Instagram video called What Causes, in quotes, COVID, the virus or the system? He starts with the usual, I'm only here for the jokes, before imploring you to take his podcast guest, a real-life scientist, seriously. But what drew my eye to this post in particular was that scientist in question, who was Northeastern psychology professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. And I love Barrett's first book, which is called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. And I had her on my Earthrise podcast back in 2017. Great, actually one of my favorite podcasts that I did during that stretch. And she has a new book out called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. I'm guessing the Brand appearance is part of the press rush for that book. As she says in this clip, this new essay collection of hers is in part an attempt to simplify points from her previous book. So it appears that she's going all in on popular science, and nothing wrong with that. The Memories, Dreams, Reflections remains Carl Jung's most famous book due to its accessibility. And if you don't know the backstory about that, you should look into it. But it's really important to speak clearly about science, so I appreciate that. And to be even clearer, nothing Barrett says in this clip is wrong. In some ways, it's both obvious and benign. Her sentiment toes a line I've often seen in the conspiritualist world. Disease is not only dependent on the virus, but also lifestyle factors. So we find ourselves in the midst of this entire germ theory versus terrain theory controversy that people like Zach Bush have been championing, which is really ridiculous. Germs cause disease, but your environment plays a primary role. It's never one or the other, and honestly, I can't believe this is even a debate. But what frustrated me about this Brand clip is that Barrett plays right into Russell's I'm just asking questions narrative. So to frame it, she cites a study in her book that was in a chapter called Emotion and Illness. In the book, she writes, quote, the diverse set of symptoms that you collectively call a cold involves not just your body, but also your mind. For example, if you are an introverted or negative-minded person, you are more likely to develop a cold from a noseful of germs, end quote. And in the interview, she discusses another factor determinative of whether or not you get sick, poverty. And there are others from this particular set of research, like lack of sleep is a good one. But let's focus on what she tells Russell. People from depressed economic conditions are more likely to get sick when a virus is placed in their noses than people who are financially stable. As Barrett says, the virus is a necessary part of getting sick, just not the only factor. But framing this specifically around COVID while on Russell Brand's podcast was destined to end in disaster. For the past 13 months, we've been inundated with conspiritualists claiming that no one is talking about the immune system when all of them are talking about the immune system.
Right.
And of course, trying to sell you supplements marketed to boost it.
Quote unquote.
I've worked in fitness for decades, as we've all worked in this world, and the immune system has been discussed forever. What I think these influencers really mean, and what Brand himself brings up in this clip, is that doctors tend to treat most diseases with drugs sold by a pharmaceutical industry that has a stronghold on legislation in the healthcare industry, and in many ways they are right. Yet they lack even the simplest desire to inject nuance into the discussion, which is why I was surprised that Barrett never pushes back against Brand. Her work is extremely nuanced. Now, as I've long argued, two things can be true. Pharmaceutical companies can be greedy and dishonest, and the current crop of vaccines can be safe and effective. The problem is you can't sell supplements, courses, and coaching sessions if the latter is true. So the conspiritualists obscure the data and only present what they want to. What I want to drill down on here is Brand's response to Barrett. The guys over at Decoding the Gurus did a wonderful job breaking down Russell's rhetorical style a few weeks ago, so I highly recommend checking that out. Now, right after Barrett says poverty is a leading indicator of who gets sick, which has massive social and political implications, here's how Brand replies.
So if it's not economically led, it's ideologically led, and it's sort of, in a sense, that speaks to some of the points that I'm making, that it's more favorable to have a solution that facilitates big tech having more access to people's lives and more access to track and trace data. Our systems favor a solution where big pharma gets to benefit and profit. These are the systems that we're heading towards. And what are these systems based on? Individualism. You are a separate animal running on these systems, what you can remember, what stimulus you... So what we need to divide is a kind of a scientifically underwritten myth that brings to the forefront collectivism, unity, togetherness, reverence and respect for individual forms of identity. But unless these myths are told, unless these stories are told, Lisa, we're in grave danger of, we're on the precipice of Armageddon, but the coronavirus is just but one example of how something that's apparently an objective reality, like you said earlier, all the coronavirus is seeking is a nice wet pair of lungs, but whose wet lungs, how many times, how often? Because otherwise, why is there a difference in what's happening in New Zealand or Taiwan or the US or the UK or Germany? Culture. So there's so many things. No objective reality. We create reality through our imagination.
Julian, translate for us. Go.
Now, Russell Brand, the main thing I want to ask you here is, would you like Caesar or ranch dressing with that word salad?
Right, exactly.
So, yes, not one thought about combating poverty, nor the importance of legislation or economically diversified reparations in minority communities that would actually address poverty. In fact, Brandt famously urged people not to vote years ago. Now, nearly 500,000 people have watched this clip and are left with no indication that anything actually needs to be done. They just listen to him rant. Now, in 2017, we passed a sales tax increase here in Los Angeles to raise $100 million to combat homelessness. And to date, I believe one shelter has been constructed in these 4 years. Bureaucracy is rampant in this city, but another problem the task force is continually met with is fierce opposition from locals whenever they try to build in a new neighborhood. And the same thing happens in New York City, where the homeless are shuffled around from hotel to hotel. Residents complain that there will be an increased theft, even though the data does not support that. And this NIMBY, the not in my backyard problem, perfectly mirrors the conspiritualist fantasy world. I want to complain about the problems and put forward my vision of utopia as long as I don't have to actually get my hands dirty. And of all the figures we've covered on this podcast, Russell Brand has just about the cleanest hands that I've seen. And I know he's donated to addiction efforts. He's done good work, and he's previously put his money where his mouth is. So I want to be clear on that. But when it comes to this past year of watching his clips, his play both sides and his COVID fantasizing, he's doing way more harm than good.
My heart rate is still up from listening to that clip, and I'm really stuck on his affect. And I think that we haven't really covered somebody, well, I think we'll probably have to do a full episode on him, somebody who has made this full leap from, straight entertainment world into pseudo-intellectualism and conspirituality. Is there anybody who compares to that?
Well, that's why I brought up JP Sears, because being a comedian Russell, even in his earlier days of comedy, he always had an intellectual edge. That's been his thing. I know there's the Katy Perry marriage and all of that, but he was always trying to think smarter in some ways. And
he's always had an incredible vocabulary that he uses to convey some sense of intellectual penetration.